So thank you for joining today's webinar, which is called Effective Food Plots, Begin with Healthy Soils. My name is Katie Okert, and I am an extension educator with MSU Extension here, and I'm based in Ionia County, and I serve the entire state doing chronic wasting disease education and outreach, as well as zoonotic disease and deer management education and outreach. So today we have a few features in our meeting format, or our, webinar format for Zoom. At any point in time, if you have any questions, if you take your mouse and you scroll it down to the bottom of your device or your computer, you'll see the question and answer, our Q&A button. If you have any questions at any point during the presentation, please feel free to type those in the chat, and Paul will be taking questions as he presents so that we can keep the conversation relevant and answer those questions as we go. If you have any technical issues, please feel free to call the MSU IT service desk at 517-432-6200 for technical support. And I will also put that in the chat here before we get started. If you have any questions, again, use that question feature. And at the end, we will have a short survey for you to take. I've got to write that number down because it's not cutting and pasting for me. So 1 second. But with that, I will turn it over to Paul to get started.
Okay, thank you, Katie. I'm going to share my screen. I think we're shared, and I believe we're ready to go.
Looks good. Thanks, Paul.
Okay, got to make sure I can advance my slides. So it's actually a pleasure to be here, and I really appreciate Katie inviting me to talk about food plots and healthy soils. I'll give a little background. I've been with Extension as a field crop educator for over 30 years, and I cover central Michigan and further north. So I've had a lot of opportunities, a lot of experiences working with wildlife food plots. You know, part of what our responsibility is to interpret soil test results. So so we get a chance to work with a lot of different soils and talk about you know, everybody wants that perfect food plot. And I'm a deer hunter. I'm not a very good one, but I do enjoy being out deer hunting, and I especially enjoy trying to develop you know, food plots. And in the last few years, actually, I've worked a lot with cover crop soil health, so it's really bode very well for the topic today. So with that, I'd also like to remind you that feel free to put those questions in the chat box as we go, so we can answer them as we go on. So I think that's kind of important we do that. So so you get the questions answered that you need in the time frame. So what we're going to talk about today is, you know, effective food plots, and we're going to talk about you know, the soil, why it's important, just some of the basic soil things, maybe just a little soil science 101. I'm going to want to talk a little bit about you know, some of the soil health principles when we talk about building our soil. What are those principles, and you know, what are some of those practices that help us do that? Talking about soil testing. If you don't hear me say it once, you'll probably hear me say it several times, how important soil testing is. And then fertilization, interpreting those soil tests after you get them. And in just a few minutes on maybe field preparation and seeding and some of those types of things. But so we'll get moving here. And you know, we talk about soil and why it's important. You know, first of all, we use kind of a scientist's definition of soil. Why it's a natural body of the Earth's surface having characteristics resulting from climate and living organisms acting upon that parent material over time. It has to do with moisture, temperature, and those things too. So I think that just gives us a basis for what soil is, but we see it as a lot more than that. You know, we see it as a medium for plant growth. You know, one of the things back in my FFA high school days, and that was quite a long time ago, you know, we always thought of soil as a medium for plant growth, and it is. But one of the things that we implied with that we could apply, we could supply a lot of the nutrients and additions to that soil, but we forgot some of the really important parts of soil and nutrient cycling and those things. And that's where the soil health kind of initiatives have came about in the last several years. So soil it's important. It's more than a medium for plant growth. The properties are kind of a principal factor in the water systems, those hydrological water cycles for all of the earth and the atmosphere. It functions, it recycles our natural systems, our wastes, our plant wastes, our animals. Everything is recycled through the soil system. We even end up in the soil as we pass on. So it functions as a natural recycling system. And probably one of the things I like to talk a lot about is how important it is for the habitat for those living organisms that are in the soil, not just large and not just small, but if you look, I've got that small picture on the right hand side of the screen about that soil food web, and it's a very complex system. And I think as we continue to learn and grow, we learn to understand those microorganisms, especially this microscopic ones, the bacteria, the fungi, the actinomycetes, the nematodes, and all those things, and how they interact together in support the function of a healthy soil. Soil influences the exchange of gases within the atmosphere. If you look at the carbon cycle, you see the soil, how it's emitting, and plants are emitting CO2, we emit ethane, we sequester carbon in the soil. All those things are one of the factors in why it's so important. And then on a kind of a human level, just as an engineering medium for our roads and our buildings and and all those types of things. And just like soil as an engineering medium, when we think about building a road or a highway, we also have to think about those soils when we start to put in food plots, when we start to manage our wildlife habitats. I think those are important things. And where do we find a lot of that? Yeah, those soil characteristics. I always invite everybody to find the soil survey book from the county where you live or where that food plot is, because it has a tremendous amount of information about those soils that you're going to be working with. And you always hear, in real estate, they always say location, location, location. And when we're working on food plots, when we have that hunting property, when we're trying to cultivate our food plots and make them successful, we kind of have to work with what we have. It's kind of hard to change some of those things. So selecting those spots for where those food plots go are really important within your hunting property. But our hunting property is our hunting property, and I almost think from a deer standpoint for wildlife habitat, I'd almost have, we always think about our soils, because most of the time our really good soils are probably being farmed agriculturally. A lot of those areas that are more recreational or maybe available as hunting property are maybe soils that aren't quite as good. When I say good, we'll talk about that, but it may not have the desired characteristics. And I guess if I had a choice between a 40 acres that had some rolling land, some swamp, and some different unique features, some hardwoods, versus an 80 acres of really good quality farmland with maybe a woods through it, I'd take that 40 acres any time ahead of, because we can build and we can grow and we can develop that property. We're going to talk just a little bit about that. But I think the important thing is, where our hunting property is, we have to work with what we have, and getting into the soil survey will tell you what type of soil you have, as far as, what the texture is, and, some of the just the properties that you might be interested in as develop that food plot. So we're going to have a little bit about talk about some of the physical properties of soil. And the two that we're really going to talk the most about are going to be texture and structure. And they're really kind of important things when we think about those physical properties. We're also going to talk about organic matter and the importance of organic matter. Texture, structure first, but when we start talking about soil health, we'll talk more about organic matter. So what about texture? The texture is in your soil is that percent of sand, silt, and clay in your soils. Now, if you look at this particular side, you see the sand particles are the largest, silt, in the middle, in clay, the really the smallest particles. It's really kind of interesting because it takes, into keeping that in perspective, it takes about 1,000 particles of clay will make one particle of sand. So there's a tremendous amount of difference. And what's important about your texture, that percent sand, silt, and clay, it really influences a lot of the things that you do with your soil in terms of, the fertility, the liming, and even the water holding capacity. When you look at some of these ideal soils, we'll talk about that a little bit later on, but clay particles, if you think of all soils have water in them, even as dry, there's different levels of water from field saturation to just to the wilting point of plants, and even down further. There's always a film of water around these soil particles. Sometimes it's held so tight that the plant can't physically pull it away. But if you look at a clay particle under a microscope, you'll see a tremendous amount of surface area on that clay particle. So what ends up happening is clay will actually hold about 10,000 times more water than an equal volume of sand. So that's really interesting. So when we have those sandy soils, we always think of them as droughty, and that's an important thing to remember when we think about texture. Here we get a little, when we look at the texture, we talk about the coarser soils and the finer soils. When we see those particle sizes, when we see our sands, those are the real coarse type soils. And then we have those classifications as we move from left to right to those finer soils, to the clays, and those are all a percent mixture of those sand, silts, and clays. And loams tend to be pretty close to equal amounts of those sand, silts, and clay. In an ideal world, that's what we'd have, but we all know that it's not always an ideal world when it comes to putting in food plots and working with the soils that we have. So when if you've done any work with soil science or anything, you've probably seen this textural triangle where you kind of make that determination about these sand, silts, and clay. So that's how, when you send a soil sample in, when they'll give you what it is, a loamy sand, sandy loam, silty clay loam. What you do is they just look at the percentages of clay, of percentages of silt, and percentages of sand. And in this particular example, we're right in the middle. We kind of have a clay loam type of soil. So that's how that's determined. But the idea is from a texture standpoint, it's sand, silt, or clay percentages. And that texture influences a number of things. That texture influences a water holding capacity. I'd mentioned earlier about clay soils versus sand soils and the potential water holding capacity. It affects drainage and aeration. Those coarse textured soils, there's a lot of space for air, space for water, as opposed to some of those heavier clay type soils that we talk about. It affects the infiltration rate, and when we have those rain events, how quickly that rain infiltrates into those soils. And of course, that also depends on management a little bit. It affects the nutrient holding capacity, and we'll talk about that a little bit when we start talking about fertilization and fertilizers, and how some soils take a little more, and the ability of sands versus clays to hold some of those cations to make them available for plant use. It affects soil temperature. Our lighter, coarser texture soils tends to reflect the sunlight, where our darker soils tend to absorb it. So sometimes they can it really affects the soil temperatures that again this the different textures, your clays versus your sands. It also impacts the shrinking and swelling. If you've planted plants, whether it be I always think of alfalfa because I've done a lot of work in alfalfa, but when you get like our clays in the spring, the freezing and thawing, those soils swell, shrink, swell and shrink. They really do it well in clay. And that's one of the reasons why if you do frost seeding into your food plots, if you're trying to do some regeneration, this is this is probably the perfect time of year to do some of that, what we call the frost seeding, where you just put that seed. A lot of times it works best for like our clovers. It's pretty standard practice in the agricultural world anyhow to frost seed red clover, and for example in our wheat. But it's those clay soils that shrinking and the swelling that happens for the freeze thaw during the day. It rolls those seeds into those crevices, so you get good seed soil contact, where frost seeding doesn't always work quite as well in your sand. So texture makes a difference from that aspect as well. One of the things that I think is really important, texture is permanent. I mean, it's about your location. If you look at that soil map, you're going to see that you may have a sandy loam, you may have a clay loam, whatever it is, it's a permanent to that property. We can't build texture, but you can't break it down either. One of the things that I know gardeners will often do in small areas, can I haul in different soil? Can I bring in some stuff to mix? And people that have heavy clay, they'll maybe want to bring some sand in to mix. And sometimes you end up with compost. If you have a clay soil and you really want to kind of improve it, probably something like a compost or something like that might be a better option if you want to kind of improve that. But texture is permanent. It's permanent to the property. I think that's kind of important to know. So then when we talk about structure, the difference between texture and structure, structure is kind of what you make it. It's that physical property of those particles being held together, cemented together. On the right, we see what I think are pretty soils with a couple pretty good structures. You see on the right, you see the PEDs, the clods, the stuff like that, and those types of things. Those are the things that the soil glues are holding them together. Even that other picture with the roots, that's, this is a whole different kind of talk, but if you've got a good healthy soil with creating good structure, you look around those roots of this particular plant. If you can see my cursor here, that's those small soil particles wrapped tight around the root, and that's kind of the effect of living roots and cover crops in the soil. I see there's a question in the chat. Okay, I'm sorry. So let's advance a little bit looking at soil structure. We can make or break our soil structure. When we have good structure, your particles are aggregated together. And in the previous slide, I showed the slide with a rhizosphere around the roots, and it's those what they call the soil glues that exudates from the roots that bind these particles together and create those small aggregates, which make larger aggregates and clods. So that's part of the structure. And structure, one of the things we'll talk about is we can destroy structure or we can build structure. And so how do we destroy structure? Compaction. We can have how we till. We start getting to excessive tillage, if we're putting heavy equipment or if we're on those food plots, if we got clays, if we're on those food plots when it's wet, we just can create a tremendous amount of compaction, whether it be deep compaction, depending on the weight of your tool, or surface compaction. And those surface compactions can really kind of be a problem, especially when we start doing excessive tillage. I know, just talking with individuals, I was just talking to one this weekend that has a rototiller pull behind the tractor for their food plots. Well, some people kind of fall in love with their tillage equipment, and we get that tillage, and then we end up making it. We shatter all those PEDs. We end up making it almost like powder. And then when we get those heavy rains, them driving rains, we can create some surface compaction pretty easy. Because if you think about, raindrops, we've had heavy rains through central Michigan here over the past, couple days. And, it really isn't impacted so much now because we have We still have some frost in the ground, but excessive tillage, when we create those surface compactions from our, the velocity of a raindrop is 25, 30 miles an hour. And when we get that excessive rain with excessive tillage, we can create that surface compaction. It can really create a problem for emergence of some of the seeds, especially some of our smaller seeded crops, some of our clovers, rape, some of those real small seeded sometimes can't push through that that if there's a surface compaction. And it also depletion of organic matter. One of the organic matter is probably the greatest driver of soil function that we have and work with, and we can really influence that by just how we manage our soil. How do we improve structure? Well, we can improve it by adding organic matter. When we start getting the decaying organic matter, you have those microbial community, all those microbes, they're chopping it up, tearing it down, and their bodies die. They create those microbial gums and stick those soil beds together. And the more we can do to improve our structure, the more we can make some sandy soils maybe a little less droughty. Our clays become better aerated, they drain better. I know just from some of the experiences of some of the farmers that I've worked with in our area have actually gone to very much reduced and almost no-till and adding cover crops. They've taken clay soils that just seem to be really tough to work with, and all of a sudden they become, as you allow the worms to work, as you allow the roots to go down through, you create those macropores. And when we get these big rain events during the summer, the water all infiltrates in much better, and it just improves the overall structure of that soil, even without field tile. And as we build up that structure, it allows our roots to penetrate. Everything seems to work better, even tillage. I always tell a story when I 4 or 5 years ago doing a cover crop workshop down in northern Indiana. I thought it was interesting. Some of it was for the Amish community, and one of the comments that one of the farmers had suggested that it actually takes, when they have a good structure to their soil and they're using cover crops, they said we can put one less horse on the team. So I don't know what that just kind of bears out, how good structure helps with good productive soil. So texture versus structure. One of the things we want to remember is that texture is unchangeable. It's something, it's you are where you are. It's about location, and really there's not a lot you can do about your texture, but there is a tremendous amount of things you can do to improve your structure, or you can destroy the structure by excessive tillage, by compaction, and all those things we had talked about earlier. So what about soil health? Part of the discussion is soil health, and soil health really, it becomes all about organic matter, and there's things that I talk about, and you're going to hear me talk about this continually almost, is we want to disturb that soil, those plots, as little as possible. We want to have something growing in that plot all season long, every month of the year as you possibly can. That will improve your soil health. It will improve your organic matter. And having different types of plants in your system, I think, is a big help. Now, there's a lot of different mixes, these wildlife mixes that we can put in, and those things are just great, because when we get those diversity of plants, we also get the diversity of those microbial communities, which help build organic matter. It also helps in the nutrient cycling in those particular soils. I love this picture because if you look close, this is an oilseed radish, and I've always said when I'm working with farmers and wildlife folks that if you have radish or some of the brassicas, you almost always have earthworms right around those. So when you have those covers, when you have those live covers, you really create an environment for that soil food web to function. As far as plant diversity, when you're talking about different species, I feel like, and even Dr. Lisa Tiemann, our soil microbiologist, she always talks about we want to have the three functional species. We want to have grasses, we want to have legumes, and we want to have brassicas in our mixes. And that, if we have at least one from each of those groups, we probably got adequate diversity. And I know a lot of our wildlife mixes contain all those things. Again, Live Roots 365. Now that almost sounds like a some logo, but that's one of our soil scientists. They always talk about having Live Roots 365, and in the agricultural setting is add livestock to your system, and we're doing food plots for deer. We certainly that's certainly adding livestock to our system. So let's talk about what a kind of an ideal soil is. And most of the time when we're talking about food plots, we're really thinking about mineral soils, because that's the predominant classes in Michigan. And that ideal soil, if we look at it, it's 25% water, 25% air, 45% mineral, and then 5% organic. Now that organic at 5% is something that when you do soil tests, when you look at that the soil survey, you'll be able to find out, say for instance, you have a Ithaca clay loam. In one of the tables, it's going to talk about what kind of a organic matter range is. And if you, as opposed to like a sphinx sand or a Remus sand, some of them will vary, or you get a Park Hill. Some of those Park Hills will be up around that 5%. But if we get into some of our northern series, like or there's a Grayling series, some of them can be down to 1.5. But each soil series has kind of an ideal organic matter where it likes to function. What's really interesting, and I think it's one of the reasons we've had so much discussion recently about soil health, is if you look at statistically, once we've started, and this has occurred over 75 to 100 years, when we've started to do more intensive tillage, in some areas of the country, we've lost organic matters. We've lost 50 to 60%. I know, talking to Dr. Kurt Steinke this about a month ago, talking about some of the different soils in the thumb, and some of the diagnostic things he talks about is looking at some of those soils, their organic matters, which you would expect them to be 4.5, are down to 1.5 in some of those lake bed soils. So, but for discussion, the ideal soil is going to be that mineral soil with that 25% air, 25% water, 45% mineral, and again that 5% organic matter. So why is organic matter so important? Organic matter is really the kind of the lifeblood of the system. We have our growing plants. We can add plants, but if we follow the arrows with our plants, by adding manure, by adding compost, and all those types of things, we kind of increase the biological activity, because in a healthy soil with moisture in the right kind of temperature, all of a sudden we create, they starts to break that down, and we break that down. We start adding that organic material. We start to improve our soil structure. We start to improve that aeration. All those attributes, all those characteristics of a good healthy soil. And organic matter really is in like three states. As they say, it's the living, the dead, and the very dead. When we talk about the living part of an organic matter, we're talking about basically that soil food web, everything that's kind of alive. And then as those plants are broken down by those microbial communities, it continues to break down further and further, where it becomes almost invisible. But then as it gets down to the furthest state, then it's what we call the humus. And that's when we do an organic matter test on our soil, that's really what we're measuring, is that humus portion. That's a very stable portion, but that humus portion and that other organic material really helps with the nutrient cycling. It provides food. It provides a carbon source for the microbial communities, and then it also starts releasing nitrogen, and it improves all those attributes we talked about a little bit earlier. So organic matter, it's a slow process. Excuse me. So when we think about trying to build our soils, and I may be getting ahead of myself or just catching up, but when we start building our soils, one of the things I always point out that we can't just do it overnight, especially if some of our soils are fairly depleted. Building organic matter in a perfect world, we can only increase it, a tenth to plus or minus every year. So, if you're thinking about improving your soils for you in your food plot, especially if it's a depleted type soil, we got to think of it as a 5-year plan, because we're only going to increase that slowly over time. But it every year it seems to get a little bit better, but you have to start now. And if you start applying some of those principles of soil health, you can start building the productivity of those food plots over time. So let's talk a little bit more about soil health and the definition. USDA has a definition. It's a physical biological characteristics that basically allows the soil to function as a vital living ecosystem that sustains plants, animals, and humans. Now if you get 17 scientists together, 17 soil scientists, they might all have a little bit variation, but good healthy soil helps regulates the water. It helps us produce those efficient crops, productivity, nutrient cycling, protecting the environment. Those good healthy soils also, the filter the water and those types of things, and provide those ecosystem services for farm in those local landscapes. So we think about the principles of soil health. We kind of covered this a little bit, but again, there's principles and then there are practices to improve these principles. And again, think about how can we do as little tillage as possible? How can we keep the soil covered? We got to keep plants growing all year. We got to diversify as much as we can as far as some of our rotations and the plants that we have, if at all possible. I know food plots, I always kind of like some of the people I work with, and even on my own, I always like to have some perennials in the plot, and I also like to have some annuals where I can put those in and kind of gauge them for the different hunting season. Having a prime plot, whether you're a bow hunter or late in the year for the rifle hunt or even further than that. So how do you evaluate your soils? Got a couple slides here. We came up with a soil health assessment card, or kind of a progress report. We released it last year. It's available on the Cover Crops and Soil Health website. And I think, Katie, we can get a link to that or get a copy to the people that requested. But basically it's a card where you can take that out and kind of just do a self-assessment. And when we're looking at that, we're looking at structure, we're looking at the biological activity, erosion, organic matter, compaction, the plant health, infiltration, water holding capacity. And these are all things that you can do visually. And here, that was the kind of the direction sheet, but here's kind of how we use this tool. We just do it by making observations. You put the date of your plot. You look at structure. You make those observations and you give it a number, give it a score. Is it really hard? Is it does it have is it got large, nice clods? What does it look like? You can make that assessment. You look at biological activity. We can look for signs of worms and how residues breaking down. That's a really good indicator of biological activity is residue breaking down. If you've got good microbial communities, that residue is not going to stay on the surface very long. And if you till it in, you're going to see it break down very quickly. Again, erosion's pretty easy to spot. You can do organic matter tests, but look for compaction, look for those hard pans. Just look for, easiest way to find that is there ponding going on in some of those areas? Dig a few roots. Are they going straight down? Are they stopping? That's just kind of a self-evaluation. We evaluate our plants. Do our plants look healthy? What's the residue? Again, the water infiltration or ponding. So what we do is we put scores to that. Then we give it a total score. Then we kind of put it away and just kind of do that every year. Take a look at that your evaluation of how to test those soils. So those desirable attributes of a healthy soil, they're fertile, fertility's good, it's got good structure, and again, this good structure is it's got good aggregates, good. It looks like cottage cheese. It's real plump. Lumps fall off. You can always tell good soil and bad soil. Any experience? I always say smell it. You can always smell good, healthy soil. Is it deep? Is it a deep, healthy soil? Does it drain? Are there pest problems? Usually good, healthy soil can reduce a lot of the pest pressure. Soils are free of toxins. And I think the big thing that we find with good, healthy soils is the resilience of the soils. As you improve that plot area, as you improve that organic matter, it becomes really resilient. It's resilient to heavy rains. It's resilient to drought. I got this picture here. Actually, it's from a local farmer that actually it's a Sphinx sand, and it's actually a couple, probably only about 1.5 organic matter originally, but they had to dig a hole here. But this is a field of alfalfa, and back in the day, this is about 12 inches of dark topsoil. 30 years ago, this farm was converted from a conventional till to no-till. And what's really interesting is to see the depth, the darkness of the topsoil that you see, and as opposed to the real almost beet sand. Right next door is actually potato fields. So when you think of healthy soils, you got to think like a root. Can you get the food? Is the structure such that you can grow down deep? Is there adequate water? You're not going to get drowned out. And is it resilient enough to allow for plant growth over time? So now we're going to, unless there is any questions right now, we're going to move into soil sampling and testing. So why do we soil test? Well, it's real simple. It's the basis for any lime and fertilizer applications. I kind of make the comparison. Soil testing is like the dentist taking an x-ray before he drills in your tooth. You don't want to be guessing. And that's the same way with you hear the tagline, don't guess, soil test. It's also can use to diagnose problems. If you got areas of a field that's really a problem, maybe you need to take a separate sample in that area, because maybe it was maybe it was an old foundation. Maybe it was, there's just a lot of things that can make that spot so much different or so difficult. So we can use it to diagnose problems, evaluate nutrients. We can test for those particle size, organic matter. We can also use the testing to analyze compost. There's the availability of compost seems like it's getting a little bit better, and compost is always good. And I don't ever think you can overdo it if you want to build a soil, if you have a readily available source of compost. And there's some of these municipal composting facilities actually have compost relatively inexpensive. It's in bulk, so that's something to consider. So how do we do it? What tools do we use? We really don't have to. It's kind of not rocket science. We can use what you have. You can use the soil probes if those things are available. Most extension offices have them. A lot of the co-op, the elevators will have them, and or you can buy one and share it, or you can just use the old spade. And this is just really a good example of sampling. The biggest thing is to get that slipe and be uniform about how you do it. I think that's the important thing. Taking a sample, when, where, how, the amount, packaging, those are all kind of important things. When do you take those samples? I think the best thing, it doesn't matter when you take them. Obviously you don't want to take them in the wintertime, this time of year. You'd like to take them in the spring or the fall. But whenever you take them at that same time every year, because nutrients do cycle. Things change, depend on moisture, temperature from the beginning of the season to the end. So I would suggest that you do it the same time. Where, make sure it's real random. We talked about how we do it, what tools we use. When we talk about preparing and packaging, when we take the sample, we don't want it to be soaking wet. Depending on where you're going to send it, there's a number of places you can send it. Of course, the MSU lab, in every extension office, you can get the soil test boxes. I think they're $13.50 now. But you want to prepare that sample. You want to get the soil fairly dry because you don't want it to you know, melt away the box. And then there's a form that goes to talk about, what the previous crop was and what you intend to plant. Fill that out properly. When you're actually sampling, you want to be really random, and you want to make sure you get a real representative sample of that area you're going to be working with. So that means kind of avoiding those odd spots, avoid the edges. Again, the biggest thing is to make it really representative. You're only going to send in one sample, but it's going to be a combination of subsamples. So I encourage people, depending on the size of your plot, just the more cores you can take, probably the better, but you're only going to need about a pint. But get those subsamples, get them combined together, and always a caution, don't use that metal bucket. When you use a metal bucket, there's a potential for some of the metals to impact that soil test result. So we always recommend using just a plastic bucket or something like that. So once the soil tests come back, wow, pack up and move. Well, we can't. So we got to work with what we got. So we have to kind of interpret those soil tests to give us the best outcome that we're looking at. So, when we talk about fertilizers, how much and what, that depends on what the soil test says. I mean, we're all over the board with soil tests. The soil tests, the fertilizers that we can potentially use, it kind of becomes mind-boggling. Should I use, it's common for people to want to use a 12-12, a 19-19, you got the potash, 60. So which one do you use? And that's really why we test our soils. So we can kind of hone down on what we actually need to use and get something that's going to give us the greatest opportunity for success. One of the first things that in my experience, and I think a lot of the soil scientists will agree, what's the cheapest nutrient you can buy? It's lime. And you got to get your pH right first. If you have no other reason to take a soil test, is to understand and know what your pH is, because that impacts plant growth tremendously. And especially now when we have some challenging fertilizer prices. I mean, I think when anybody that's been working with food plots and kind of pricing out, if you went to the co-op, if you went to the farm supply and looked at what they're charging for fertilizer, we want to start by buying the cheapest nutrient, and that's lime. I see okay. Thanks, Katie, put in the testing. So what I think is really important here, when we're in that range, this 6.2 to 6.3, I'm a little bit more biased on a higher pH. I like it 6.5 to 7.3, but that's just me. And it really impacts what species. Some of the legumes, are going to do better in that 6.8 to 7.3 area. And, but if we want to do like some of our clovers, if we do have a low pH and we want to get it fixed, if we can't do it, it takes a while for lime to interact and neutralize the acidity in the soil. So, but I think the important thing of this slide is get your pH right, because if you look at our major macronutrients, our nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, calcium, magnesium, they're all most readily available, in that optimum pH range. So in Paul's world, get the pH right first.
Paul,
yes.
We have a question that I'd like to have you answer live.
Okay.
What do you think about liquid lime?
What do I think about liquid lime? Liquid lime, my experience with liquid lime over the years, back probably, well, it's kind of ages me, but it's probably been 15 years ago. And they were talking about these liquid lime, these chelated calcium products, lime products. where they want you to put, they only want you to put a quart or something to the acre, and my answer to that is it takes a ton of lime to neutralize a ton of acidity. And if you look at how, when you have acid soil, you have hydrogen-free ions in the soil, and they actually you have to have that calcium has to attach to that. So I'm not a big fan of the liquid lime. It doesn't, it's an expensive kind of way to buy lime because it may give you some really short-term immediate impact. A lot of times, my experience, you used to put it in the furrow when you planted, and I just don't think you get the neutralizing value from a liquid lime product to neutralize the acidity in that soil. So let's take a look at some soil tests and interpreting some of these results. And I've got a couple soil tests from the MSU lab that I pulled out from folks that I've worked with over the years. So when you get your report back, and if you can see my cursor, this is going to be your nutrient levels. This is going to have a pH is going to be here. Now this is 7.5. That's pretty good. And our phosphorus, now the MSU lab is in parts per million. If you have a lab that has pounds per acre, the calculation is parts per million times 2 will give you pounds per acre. So for example, on this particular, if it's 35 parts per million, it would be 70 pounds per acre. But when we look at the phosphorus, we look at the potassium, we look at the manganese, you see they're in, like, the phosphorus is in the upper end of the optimum range. The potassium is just a little bit low. And so where does this range come from? It actually comes, if we're going to slip down to the bottom here, when it makes, it tells you the nutrient level for a wildlife forage legume. If it was something else, that might be a little different, but for this legume, the phosphorus is optimum. So we probably won't have to put much phosphorus. It'll probably require more potassium, in the magnesium. When we look at these additional results, we see the calcium, we see the cation exchange capacity, and it gets in CEC. And really what that means is the lower, and this is kind of a chemistry question, is if you look at a soil particle, we talked about the sands and the clays, there's so much more surface area on a clay. So when I look at, the CECs range from 1 to probably we get organic once we get over, like 16 to 20, the CECs. But what it means, when I see a 14, I say this is a fairly high loamy soil. So it usually will take more, because it'll hold the cations better. It has more sites on those clay particles as opposed to a sand particle. I hope that makes sense. And then they got the percent of bases is another thing. And so the recommendations here is for no limestone, no lime, because we see that high pH. And it says what our target pH is for that legume, and our target pH is 6.8. So when you fill out the form, you're going to select what you want to grow, and this is for this legume, and then you're going to ask, it's going to tell you how many ton, what is your expected yield. And this is 4 ton. This is probably, for wildlife, that probably in a plot that might be optimistic, but nonetheless and so it gives us our fertilizer recommendations for a 4 ton yield of a wildlife forage legume. So there's because it's a legume, there's going to be, because it'll make its own nitrogen, there'll be 0 nitrogen recommendation. The phosphate, the phosphate is 50 pounds per acre, and the potassium is 205. Now, if you lowered that, if you lowered down that to 1 ton, there might not be any phosphate recommendation. And then for almost all the time on legumes, they're usually going to recommend maybe a little bit of boron. Oftentimes, like with alfalfas, you never want to put that boron on in the seeding year, but it does have that recommendation. And we also have an opportunity to, when you do the MSU soil tests, and most other commercial labs will have it, is you'll also have an opportunity to have a second crop. And if you look down at number 2 here, for the second crop is brassica, and it's 3 tons. So brassica is not a legume. So that's where we get this nitrogen recommendation here. Brassica has a lesser requirement for phosphorus, and then the potassium is much less as well. So let's look at another one. This is another one. This is actually in our county to the west side. The pH is really low here. These are 2 kind of completely different soil tests. So we see that, our phosphorus is considered low. Our lime is our pH is 5. Potassium is considered below optimum, magnesium below optimum, and calcium is quite low. But here's the CEC again. Remember the last one was 14.1. That tells me it's a clay loam. And in a CEC this low of 5 tells me it's a fairly sandy type of soil. And then again, we see the lime recommendation here is 2.2 tons. And it'll also tell you, it just flipped down in the notes, because our magnesium is low, it's going to recommend the dolomitic lime for that particular food plot. But our target pH is 6.5. So our CR5 is considerably lower. So it's a 2.2 ton per acre recommendation. Instead of trying, I'm a big fan of lime. I'd probably up that, make sure I got a good 2.5 ton on, especially in the seeding year. This is for peas, probably Austrian winter peas. And again, you get this recommendation for that 3 ton yield. When we think about lime, in some situations we have really low pHs, and you never really, because some of the will recommend up to 5 ton to the acre, and that's a lot of lime. And they usually recommend you never put over 4 ton on a year. And even if you're putting 4 ton on, a lot of times they recommend putting 2 ton on and then work it in, and then put the other 2 ton on. Excuse me. But we're usually working with food plots. If you're in the lime, sometimes it's hard to get the equipment in there. There's a lot of challenges with it, depending on the size and the location. Sometimes if it requires 3 ton, put it all, or 5 ton, just put it all on, because we sometimes don't have the luxury of getting that equipment back in a more timely manner. So here's another one, a similar one with a similar pH of 5. But here in this case, you see how high the phosphorus is. So there'll be no recommendation for phosphorus. Our potassium is above optimum. Again, our magnesium is low. But look at the CEC. This is almost beach sand, 2.9. Pretty significant in terms of, and again, because of the low magnesium, they're asking for dolomite lime. And this recommendation is for buckwheat, 40 bushel to the acre of buckwheat. That's buckwheat's a great food plot crop. It's a great cover crop. It establishes really quick. You can get quick cover, and you can use it in a lot of different ways. It attracts, it's a great pollinator. The pheasants love it. Deer love it. But looking at this particular recommendation, again, it's the target of pH is 6. It requires 2.2 ton, and that's based on the soil type. So they won't always exactly be the same. Again, 40 pounds of nitrogen, no phosphate because of that high phosphate level up here, and because we're above optimum, it really very little potassium as well. So how much fertilizer? It really depends on what your soil test tells you. And I think that's really an important thing to remember. And that's why you soil test. One of the things that we think about is if you don't have a soil test, how do I fertilize? You know, it's sometimes it's pretty standard to put on like a triple 19 or a triple 12. And if you got reasonably decent soil, you know, a couple 100 pounds of that ahead of planting is probably pretty good, because you know you don't really know what you have, and it depends on your mix. If you're real heavy toward a legume versus if you've got a legume grass brassica mix. So it really, how much you put on depends on your soil test, depends on your species mix. So that's why it's so important to get that soil test up front. What about gypsum? You know, we get this question a lot, and there's a fair amount of gypsum that gets put out, and gypsum is just calcium sulfate. And I always caution people with gypsum. Um, you know, is it a quick fix for those clay soils? Because we always hear gypsum is in the ag world is always kind of sold as, it's actually sold as a, you know, it says, well, it's a lime product if you need lime. Well, that's we really don't, our scientists don't really think that. Will it soften up the surfaces of the soil? We've not been able to prove that. I know we've had a local farmer that's put a ton onto the acre, and is not really, he actually quit doing it. I think one of the biggest benefits of gypsum, and I'll continue to go, you know, as far as improving the structure, you know, we really haven't been able to prove that. You know, where gypsum works the best when you got high levels of sodium in the soil. In Michigan, we really have, our clay soils really don't have high levels of sodium. Now there's some parts like over in our area, in the Midland area, and you know, there's, you know, part of the reason Dow Chemical was in Midland because we had salt water down below, and they used that early on. But you know, some of the farmers that have some irrigation there, you know, will get a little salinity in their water, and that might be an opportunity to use them. But you know, gypsum works really well in high sodium soils. It knocks that it knocks that atom off, and suspends it, and kind of gets rid of it. But the real reason I think people see the results, and like our fertility folks talk about, you know, gypsum is a heck of a good source of sulfur. And I think we can't forget that sulfur as a nutrient that we need to supply to our food plots in this day and age. Because if you look at the maps historically back in, boy, I'm thinking, I don't really, whenever the Clean Air Act was passed, when we started cleaning up some of our sulfur going out of our smokestacks, and with some of our industries leaving, you know, we used to get atmospheric deposition of 30, you know, I'm kind of paraphrasing, guessing here, but you know, anywhere 30 to 40 pounds a year just in atmospheric deposition of sulfur. So we really had no sulfur recommendation for any of our crops. But because that, we're really not getting hardly any deposition at all now. So most soil tests, most recommendations, especially if it's a grass or responsive crop in the field crop stand, from like our wheat, our corn, you know, they're going to recommend 25 to 30 pounds, up to that much of sulfur being added. And in the gypsum is an excellent source of sulfur over time.
Oh, we have a question in the chat.
Yeah.
Do you want me to read it, or do you want to?
I can look at it.
Okay.
Northern Michigan sandy soil, is it worth? We've been spreading. It's always worth to test it. It's always worth testing. You know, and I know those soils can be sandy, but in the kind of the reason to know is for just for pH alone, to know where it's at. You know, you can grow, you know, barley and clover if that's all you want. You know, that's, you know, if you're having good success, you know, you probably wouldn't have to, but I really feel like every soil should be tested, just so you know where you're at or what you're missing. If you're growing barley and clover, you know, your pHs don't have to always be that high, but I certainly would test. Okay, if there's any other questions about soil fertility or soil or fertilizer recommendations, put them in the chat if you would. I want to talk just for a minute as we're kind of getting up toward the end of the hour, I think. I don't want to take too much time and save it if there's any questions, but field preparation is really kind of a key how you prepare. And when I think about preparing food plots for to be successful, I always think at one of the the key things is to keep weeds under control. My experience in talking with friends and people establishing, especially if it's kind of new, the weeds are your enemy. And that extra, the saplings, except you break it, you got to do something to get those weeds under control if you want to be successful, because so many times we can start with what we think is a really clean seed bed, and we've got quite a seed bank built up so many times, and sometimes it can really overtake your food plot very easily. And if you want to, some people want to use sprays, some people don't. Glyphosate, works pretty well for controlling a lot of plants. If you're going to use 2,4-D and some of those other products, kind of be careful. There's a time where, if you put on too much, you can't plant right away. We can prepare the seed bed conventionally. We can no-till it. I've seen food plot managers go in and spray it off, because some of these can be very stony, very rocky, and as soon as you start tilling it up, you're having a rock festival. And I didn't like it as a kid, and I don't like it as an older guy, to go out and pick stones out of these. So then people will opt for no-till. It can work very effectively, but you got to get the weeds under the control, and you have to have a drill that's set up that you can slit that surface and get that seed placed right where you'd like it. So I mean, this is like Captain Obvious here. Soil moisture is important, when you're seeding your plots. If you can time it, especially if there's a little risk of weeds, sometimes if you can get the crop in and it can pop out of the ground, kind of maybe get ahead of the weeds. If I've seen people use a kind of an organic strategy, is they'll till and they'll put like an oats or barley in, like right away in the spring, or a buckwheat, because they emerge really quick, and they kick their seeding rate up, and then they'll go in and let that grow. Of course, they'll put the little fertilizer down, and then once that kind of matures midsummer, they'll go in and they'll till it down, and they'll put their fall planting in, where they'll want to maybe bow hunt over, it'll be a different species, so, but you'll have something competitive growing that will outcompete those weeds. And maybe you have to do that a couple of years in a row, till it. But the idea is when you have those species growing, it does provide wildlife food, but it also helps control and manage the weeds. And again, they're really your enemy. Broadcast seeding, that depending on the size of the area and the equipment, you got to use what you have, and you have to work with the soil that you have. But if some of those smaller areas, if it means broadcast seeding, get it leveled out pretty good, leveled and firm. But then I always suggest that if you have an old cully packer or roller or bed springs, just to kind of scuff it in, if you're going to do it on a surface like this. Seeding, we want to get the seed in soil contact. We want to get it buried, because if we can use some type of drill, that's better. But we need to get it in. We need to get it covered. And a lot of these seeds, I'd like them to be in at least a quarter inch, eighth to a quarter inch, so they can get those roots down into the moisture. What about your seeding rates? Most of the seeds that you're going to plant, they have suggested seeding rates. There's an awful lot of, even the seed that you buy, if it's a wildlife mix, it'll tell you what the suggested seeding rate is. Is more better? Well, it depends. It's, if I'm planting a grass, if it's a relatively cheap seed, if I'm doing it to build my soil, if I'm doing it to compete with weeds, yeah, I'll up the rates. I'm a big fan of like oats, barley, wheat, rye, those cereals, they're relatively inexpensive to come on, especially if you're trying to manage, that first early spring planting, if you don't have anything growing, and then just flip that over and plant midsummer what you really want for your wildlife mix, whether it's a brassicas and some of the clovers and those types of things. And it's timing, time it so it's in pretty good shape during the hunting season. And then you also, and this is where I like to have some of the perennials in there, have it stocked up so you have some winter feed for the deer and for the wildlife. So those seeding rates, it's follow the manufacturer, the label recommended, but sometimes upping it in a certain situations can be very helpful. I put in pure live seed because some of these different seeds that you'll see on the tag, especially if it's a certified seed, that have pure live seed. When they have a recommendation for seed, if you want to plant so many pounds of seed, they're usually talking about pure live seed, and some species, the pure live seed is not. You got to look at that tag, so make sure you just don't want to. If it recommends having 6 pounds, but if you only got 90% pure live seed, you need to up that a little bit. Okay, we got another question.
Yep. What timing do you recommend for that early spring planting of rye oats to outcompete the weeds?
I would do it as soon as you can get out there. As soon as the soil conditions are right. So that's going to be, that's like, and I can say, I will talk about just like in our area. I'm an old farm kid. We used to plant oats. We would plant oats in late March if we could. And then April, as you further, depending on where you're at in the state, but I would plant it as soon as the ground is okay. And I say rye, and this is interesting. I learned something. The old dogs can learn new tricks. Rye is a winter cereal, like wheat, like triticale, spelt. They require, in order for them to set up a seed stock, they have to be planted in the winter. They have to have a cooling. They have to have vernalization, what they call it. So I was kind of interested. So 2 years ago, or maybe it was 3, there was a food plot person that I kind of, I think I advised. I don't know. They did what I said once. I don't know if that qualifies, but I wanted to see what rye would do, because like wheat, if you plant wheat in the spring, it will just continue to tiller. So actually they planted rye in a food plot because they wanted something growing. They wanted to control the weeds, and they planted like 2 bushel of rye, and it was amazing how it popped out of the ground, and it was tremendous ground cover. It didn't shoot up a seed stock because we didn't have the vernalization, the cold. And then they worked that up at the end of July and then planted their fall hunting plots material. But barley and oats, plant them as early as you can. They pop out of the ground really fast. Buckwheat's a little bit, I would wait a little later. It's a little more of a warm season type of plant. The last thing is, if you're planting legumes, inoculate that seed. If you're planting like the Austrian winter pea, some of those legumes, you'll need to inoculate, especially if it's kind of a virgin ground, has never had those legumes in it. Inoculation is pretty inexpensive. I would err on the side of inoculating it, even if it has, it just seems like the legumes perform better. And if you buy inoculant, you have to keep it cool, keep it dry, because it can go bad, because it's actually, some of them are live. But like the inoculant for an Austrian winter pea, a winter pea is different than the inoculant for like an alfalfa or a clover or something like that. So with that, I think as you think about your plot and build your plot, it kind of gives you an opportunity to have a hunting experience with and with a kid, a grandkid, or something like that. But just remember that working with these food plots, especially if it's kind of new, it takes time. It takes a lot of time. So with that, I guess I would open it for questions. Katie, there's a question.
Yeah, there's a question in the Q&A. Once you plant your spring rye and it starts to grow, how tall do you let it get before you cut it? Or is it best not to cut it at all?
Well, if you're using it just as a cover in a food area, I wouldn't cut it. I would because see, it'll only get because it doesn't shoot up your seed stalk, it just tillers. So it's very leafy. It provides for halfway decent grazing, and it's really not spring rye. It's the regular cereal rye. But I planted in the spring, and it was just very successful for us. I was just really tickled, and I haven't done it again, but I'm confident enough to recommend it.
Yeah, so another question is, are there additional webinars planned for other food plot topics? If so, where do you find information? Well, that is a great question. That Paul, if you don't mind, if I can answer quick.
Yeah, go ahead.
Above in the chat to everyone, there is a link. Look, as Paul went, I put in the links to the soil report card and then also the MSU soil testing home site. So you have those links, and those will be sent out with the recording and the a copy of the slide set from the presentation tonight. Probably I've got to get it the presentation closed captioned, but so by Friday you'll get that. And one of the questions in that evaluation is, what other topics are you interested in? So if you can talk about what you're interested in, and then all of our events are also located on the MSU Extension Chronic Wasting Disease website. And I've got to put that in. Sorry about that. Let me give that to everybody. That's going to go in the chat. So you can kind of follow what programs are available on that site under news. There will always be an article that says what upcoming programs that there are in this program area with habitat management, deer management, chronic wasting disease. We may dabble a little bit for those of you in the north about bovine tuberculosis. So that'll be a one-stop shop for any of your deer related program area opportunities. So thank you. If there's, we'll give it a minute for some additional questions.
Yeah, feel free to pop them in.
I'm going to